Robert Miller's weathered hands trembled as he stared at the DNA test results, the official seal of the Montana State Laboratory burning into his vision like a brand. The courtroom fell into suffocating silence. 100% Canis lupus, eastern gray wolf. Judge Harrison's gavel clattered to the floor. Sheriff Marcus Stone lurched forward, his face draining of color as 3 years of assumptions shattered like glass. The bailiff's radio crackled with urgent static, breaking the stunned quiet that had swallowed the packed courtroom whole. Robert's mind reeled back to that snowy October morning when he'd found the tiny dying creature in the roadside ditch, those innocent brown eyes, those oversized paws he'd dismissed as puppy clumsiness. Margaret's voice echoed from memory, "Never pass a soul in need, Bobby." "Immediate euthanization order." Stone's voice cracked with barely contained fury and vindication. How many nights had his shadow, slept peacefully beside his bed? How many mornings had those powerful jaws gently retrieved his slippers? 3 years of love, and he'd been living with a predator capable of tearing him apart. What else had he been blind to? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. The autumn wind rattled the windows of Robert Miller's modest cabin as he sat in his worn leather recliner, staring at the empty chair across from him. 2 years had passed since cancer claimed Margaret, yet he still caught himself setting 2 coffee cups each morning, the muscle memory of 45 years of marriage refusing to fade. At 68, Robert had learned that silence could be louder than any storm, pressing down on his chest until breathing felt like work. "Morning, honey," he whispered to Margaret's photograph on the mantel, her gentle smile frozen in time from their last anniversary. The retired forest ranger had spent 30 years protecting Montana's wilderness, but nothing had prepared him for protecting his heart from the crushing weight of solitude. Some days the only sounds in the house were the ticking grandfather clock and his own voice talking to memories. Pine Ridge, Montana, population 2,847, nestled in the shadow of the Bitterroot Mountains like a secret kept by the forest itself. Dense stands of Douglas fir and lodgepole pine stretched for miles in every direction, creating a wilderness so vast that a man could disappear and never be found. It was exactly the kind of place Robert had always loved, until loneliness transformed its beauty into a reminder of everything he'd lost. The town's tight-knit community had rallied around him after Margaret's funeral, bringing casseroles and kind words. But grief had a way of making a man an island, and gradually the visits stopped. His grown children called dutifully every Sunday from their busy lives in Denver and Seattle, but phone calls couldn't fill the Margaret-shaped hole in his daily routine. Robert's modest pension stretched thin, especially after Margaret's medical bills. The 20-acre property that had once felt like paradise now felt like a responsibility too heavy for aging shoulders. He'd considered selling, moving to one of those senior communities in town, but Margaret was buried in Pine Ridge Cemetery. Leaving felt like abandoning her all over again. Sheriff Marcus Stone represented everything solid about small-town law enforcement, until tragedy shattered his world 5 years ago. At 45, Stone had been a devoted father and respected officer, the kind of man who coached Little League on weekends and never missed a school play. Then wolves killed his 8-year-old son Tommy during a camping trip, and something fundamental broke inside him. The gentle man who once rescued injured animals became obsessed with eliminating every wolf in the county. His wife left, unable to watch grief transform her husband into someone she no longer recognized. Dr. Sarah Johnson, the town's only veterinarian, carried the additional burden of being Stone's daughter. At 42, she'd built a practice based on compassion for all creatures, a philosophy that increasingly put her at odds with her father's crusade. The tension between professional ethics and family loyalty had created fractures in their relationship that seemed beyond repair. It was into this landscape of broken hearts and bitter memories that fate would soon deliver a tiny, dying creature, setting in motion events that would force everyone to confront what it truly meant to love, without conditions. October 15th arrived with an unseasonable snowstorm that caught Pine Ridge off guard, the kind of early winter blast that turned familiar roads into treacherous ribbons of ice. Robert had driven into town for his weekly grocery run, a ritual that had become his primary human contact since Margaret's passing. The local Safeway had become his social lifeline, brief conversations with cashiers and nods to neighbors filling the silence that waited at home. The storm hit without warning as he loaded his modest purchases into his old Ford pickup. Within minutes, fat snowflakes transformed into a blinding curtain that made Highway 89 nearly invisible. Robert gripped the steering wheel tighter, his Ranger training keeping him steady as visibility dropped to mere yards. At his age, these mountain roads demanded respect, especially when nature decided to flex her muscles. He was thinking about Margaret, as he often did during the drive home. She'd loved October storms, always insisting they cozy up by the fireplace with hot cocoa and her mystery novels. "Even the weather's trying to bring us together," she'd tease, as if the universe conspired to create perfect moments. The memory was both comfort and knife twist, reminding him how empty the cabin would feel when he returned. That's when his headlights caught something dark against the white shoulder of the road. Robert's foot found the brake instinctively, years of rescue training overriding his desire to reach home safely. Through the swirling snow, a small black form lay motionless in the shallow ditch beside the highway. His hazard lights painted the scene in amber pulses as he pulled over, emergency flashers cutting through nature's chaos like a beacon. The creature was barely visible beneath the accumulating snow, a tiny puppy, maybe 6 weeks old, its black fur matted and frozen. Robert's experienced hands found a weak pulse, his paramedic training from his Ranger days taking over before his heart could fully process the scene. The little one's breathing was shallow and labored, each exhale a visible puff in the frigid air. "Easy there, little guy," Robert whispered, his voice rougher than intended. The puppy's eyes fluttered open briefly, deep brown and impossibly trusting, even in the face of death. Something in that gaze reminded him of Margaret's unwavering faith that everything happened for a reason. Robert wrapped the dying creature in his emergency blanket, surprised by how light the puppy felt, all bones and matted fur, clearly abandoned and slowly starving. As he carefully lifted the bundle, he noticed the unusually large paws and pointed ears, but hypothermia was the immediate enemy. Questions about breed could wait. The drive home became a race against time. Robert kept one eye on the treacherous road and one on the passenger seat, where the puppy lay eerily still. "Come on, boy. Don't you dare give up on me," he murmured. The same words he'd whispered to Margaret during her final hospital stays. The irony wasn't lost on him. After 2 years of praying for something to fill the silence, here was a creature even more helpless than he felt. At the cabin, Robert worked with methodical precision honed by decades of wilderness emergencies. He positioned the puppy beside the fireplace, using heating pads and warm towels to slowly raise the body temperature. The little one accepted his ministrations without resistance, those remarkable eyes tracking Robert's every movement with an intelligence that seemed almost human. "You're going to need a name," Robert said softly, scratching gently behind ears that seemed disproportionately large. The puppy was black as midnight, moving like a shadow in the firelight's dance. "How about Shadow? You've got that mysterious look about you." At the sound of that name, the puppy's tail managed the faintest wag, just once, but enough to seal something profound between them. Robert felt a stirring in his chest that he'd thought died with Margaret, a sense of purpose beyond mere survival. He should have called the authorities, should have checked for missing pet reports, should have asked more questions about how a puppy ended up dying on a remote highway during a snowstorm. Instead, he chose to honor Margaret's most fundamental belief: never pass a soul in need. That first night, Shadow slept curled against Robert's leg, the puppy's warmth chasing away a coldness that had nothing to do with Montana weather. For the first time in 2 years, Robert fell asleep to sounds other than the ticking clock, the gentle breathing of another living being who needed him. He had no way of knowing that his simple act of compassion had set in motion events that would challenge everything he thought he knew about love, loyalty, and the true nature of family. In saving Shadow's life, Robert had unknowingly rescued himself and opened a door to a future neither man nor beast could have imagined. 6 months transformed Shadow from a dying scrap of fur into something that made Robert question everything he thought he knew about dogs. The transformation was so gradual that Robert rationalized each change, each unusual behavior, each impossible growth spurt. Love, he discovered, was an excellent accomplice to denial. By spring, Shadow had reached 60 pounds of solid muscle and showed no signs of slowing down. His shoulders now reached Robert's hip, and those oversized paws he'd found endearing as a puppy now seemed proportionate to a frame that suggested he'd grow much larger. The pointed ears that had given him such an alert expression as a baby now stood erect like radar dishes, constantly rotating to catch sounds Robert couldn't hear. "He's just going to be a big dog," Robert told himself each morning, watching Shadow patrol the property with military precision. The veterinary supply catalog suggested German Shepherds could reach 80 pounds, and Robert clung to that possibility like a lifeline. "Margaret always said I needed someone to keep me in line." But it was Shadow's behavior that truly set him apart from any dog Robert had ever known. The creature avoided other dogs completely, showing no interest in the social play that defined canine interaction. When neighbors walked their pets past the property, Shadow would watch from a distance with an intensity that made other animals nervous. His hunting instincts were surgical in their precision. Rabbits and squirrels disappeared with swift efficiency that suggested predatory programming beyond domestic breeding. Dr. Sarah Johnson noticed the anomalies during Shadow's routine checkups, her professional eye cataloging details that Robert either dismissed or explained away. The bone structure was wrong for any domestic breed, the muscle development too focused on power rather than companionship. His teeth were designed for tearing rather than the grinding action common in dogs-fed commercial food. "Robert, I really think we should run some genetic testing," Dr. Johnson suggested during a visit in early summer. "Shadow's growth patterns and behavioral markers are unusual. It would help us provide better care if we understood his breeding." "He's family, not a science project," Robert replied with the defensive edge that had become his standard response to questions about Shadow's nature. "Every dog's different, Sarah. You know that better than anyone." But privately, Robert was beginning to acknowledge what his heart refused to accept. Shadow's nighttime behavior had become impossible to ignore. The creature would position himself at the cabin's windows after dark, scanning the forest with an alertness that never seemed to diminish. His eyes reflected light differently than any dog Robert had known, glowing with an amber intensity that seemed almost supernatural in the darkness. The transformation reached its crisis point on a warm August evening when Robert was awakened by a sound that froze his blood. It wasn't a bark. No domestic dog made that haunting primal call that seemed to echo from the depths of evolutionary memory. It was a howl, pure and wild, rising from Shadow's throat with such power that it seemed to shake the cabin's foundation. Robert found Shadow on the back porch, his massive head tilted toward a full moon that painted his black coat silver. For a moment, the creature looked exactly like what he was, a wild predator responding to instincts older than human civilization. When Shadow noticed Robert watching, he stopped immediately, but the damage was done. The pretense they'd both maintained was finally irretrievably shattered. "Sweet Jesus," Robert whispered, his ranger's knowledge finally overriding his grandfather's denial. Every behavior, every physical characteristic, every hunting instinct suddenly aligned into a terrifying truth. "You're not a dog at all, are you?" That night, Robert sat at his computer for hours, researching wolf behaviors and comparing them to Shadow's daily routine. The evidence was overwhelming. The hunting techniques, the social avoidance, the territorial marking, the way Shadow positioned himself for maximum sight lines and escape routes, everything pointed to a creature operating on wild instincts rather than domestic programming. The realization should have terrified him. Instead, it broke his heart. For 8 months, he'd loved unconditionally, and Shadow had returned that love with absolute loyalty. DNA didn't change the fact that this creature had ended his loneliness, given him purpose, made him laugh for the first time since Margaret's death. Family wasn't about genetics, it was about choice, about showing up, about loving someone despite their differences. But Robert's acceptance didn't extend to the rest of Pine Ridge. Martha Henderson, his nearest neighbor, had begun making comments about Shadow's size and unusual behavior. The Pattersons' golden retriever refused to walk past Robert's property, whimpering and pulling against the leash whenever they approached. Children who had once been eager to pet the cute puppy now watched Shadow with the wariness reserved for something their instincts told them was dangerous. The community's growing unease reached a tipping point when Shadow's presence at the annual Pine Ridge Summer Festival caused a near panic. Local dogs cowered or became aggressively defensive, and several children burst into tears at the sight of him. Robert left early. Shadow pressed against his leg in a protective stance that only reinforced the crowd's fears. "That's no dog," Martha Henderson announced loudly enough for half the festival to hear. "I've lived in Montana for 70 years, and I know a wolf when I see one. That thing is going to kill someone's child." The comment reached Sheriff Marcus Stone's ears within hours. Stone had been monitoring the situation from a distance, his professional instincts warring with the department's policy of avoiding unnecessary conflicts with respected community members. But a potential wolf in residential areas triggered every protective instinct carved into his soul by Tommy's death. Stone's investigation began quietly. Drive-bys of Robert's property, conversations with concerned neighbors, research into the legal requirements for exotic animal ownership. The more he learned about Shadow's behavior and physical characteristics, the more his professional alarm bells rang. This wasn't paranoia or grief-talking. This was a legitimate public safety concern that demanded official action. The confrontation came on a sweltering September afternoon when Stone appeared at Robert's door with a clipboard and the weight of legal authority. Shadow's reaction was immediate and telling. He positioned himself between Robert and the uniformed officer, his body language shifting from pet to protector in ways that made Stone's hand instinctively move toward his service weapon. "Robert, we need to talk about your dog," Stone said, his voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone delivering life-changing news. "I've received multiple complaints about unusual behavior, and frankly, what I'm seeing doesn't look like any domestic breed I've encountered." "He's never hurt anyone," Robert replied, his hand resting protectively on Shadow's head. "He's gentle as a lamb, Marcus. You know me. I wouldn't put anyone at risk." "I know you believe that," Stone said quietly. "But I need you to understand something, Robert. If that animal is what I think it is, love won't stop natural instincts when they kick in, and when they do, someone's gonna die." The words hung between them like a death sentence, carrying the weight of legal authority and personal tragedy. For the first time since finding Shadow, Robert faced the possibility that love might not be enough to protect the family he'd chosen. The court order arrived on a Tuesday morning that felt like any other until it wasn't. Robert's arthritic fingers trembled as he read the legal language that transformed his companion into evidence, his family into a case number. Mandatory genetic testing of canine specimen known as Shadow within 72 hours or face contempt of court charges. The words might as well have been written in a foreign language for all the sense they made to a man whose only crime was loving something the world deemed dangerous. 72 hours, Robert whispered to Margaret's photograph, his voice cracking like autumn leaves. They're giving us 3 days to prove what we already know in our hearts. Shadow pressed against his legs, those intelligent amber eyes sensing distress in ways that transcended species. The creature who had spent 18 months learning to read Robert's moods now recognized the scent of despair. Doctor. Sarah Johnson's veterinary clinic felt like a courthouse as Robert carried the court papers through the front door. The familiar waiting room, usually filled with the comfortable chaos of pet ownership, seemed sterile and judgmental. Even the motivational posters about animal care looked accusatory. Sarah emerged from the back office, her professional smile faltering when she saw Robert's expression. "The genetic testing," Robert said without preamble, placing the legal documents on her reception counter like a surrender. "How much?" Sarah's face went pale as she scanned the court order. $3,000 for comprehensive DNA analysis. More money than Robert had seen in one place since Margaret's funeral expenses. His pension covered basic living costs, but this kind of financial demand might as well have been $3 million. The arithmetic of fixed income versus legal requirements was a math problem with no good solutions. "Robert, there might be payment plans," Sarah began, but Robert was already shaking his head. "No charity," he said firmly, echoing Margaret's pride that had sustained them through decades of modest living. "This family pays its own way." That afternoon, Robert drove to Missoula with Shadow riding shotgun, the way they'd traveled everywhere together for 18 months. The pawn shop on Higgins Avenue specialized in estate jewelry, a euphemism that made selling Margaret's wedding ring feel slightly less like betrayal. The diamond that had symbolized 45 years of marriage was appraised at $2,800, close enough to cover the testing, far enough from its emotional value to break Robert's heart all over again. "She'd understand," Robert told Shadow as they sat in the parking lot afterward, the empty ring box like a weight in his pocket. "Margaret always said family comes first, no matter the cost." The DNA collection process took less than 10 minutes, a simple cheek swab that would determine Shadow's fate and, by extension, Robert's future. Dr. Johnson handled the procedure with professional efficiency, but Robert could see the conflict in her eyes. As Sheriff Stone's daughter, she understood the law enforcement perspective. As a veterinarian, she recognized the extraordinary bond between man and animal that defied easy categorization. "Results will take 10 business days," she explained, sealing the sample in an official laboratory envelope. "Robert, whatever this test reveals, Shadow's behavior over the past year and a half should count for something. He's never shown aggression toward humans." "Tell that to my father," came a voice from the clinic's entrance. Sheriff Marcus Stone filled the doorway, his uniform carrying the weight of legal authority and personal conviction. "Sarah, you know I respect your professional opinion, but public safety trumps sentiment." The confrontation that followed would be remembered by everyone present as the moment Pine Ridge's community fractures became irreparable chasms. Robert faced Stone across the clinic's examination table, Shadow positioned protectively between them, while Dr. Johnson struggled to maintain professional neutrality despite her personal loyalties. "Marcus, this animal has lived peacefully in our community for 18 months, Robert said, his ranger's authority matching Stone's law enforcement presence. "He's proven his character through actions, not assumptions." 18 months of good behavior doesn't erase millions of years of predatory instincts, Stone replied, his voice carrying the weight of personal trauma that transformed professional duty into crusade. When those instincts activate, Robert, good intentions won't save the victim. The debate that erupted exposed fault lines that had been building beneath Pine Ridge's surface for years. Stone's obsession with eliminating wolves had created tension within the community, but most residents had supported his efforts as necessary protection. Now, faced with a specific animal who had demonstrated no aggression, the abstract became personal. Dr. Johnson found herself caught between her father's legitimate concerns and her professional assessment of Shadow's temperament. "Dad, I've examined Shadow multiple times. His stress responses are minimal, his social behaviors are adapted to human interaction, and he's shown remarkable impulse control in challenging situations." "Professional opinion noted," Stone replied curtly. "But my job is preventing the next tragedy, not analyzing the last 18 months of good behavior." Word of the mandatory testing spread through Pine Ridge like wildfire, dividing the community into camps that reflected deeper philosophical differences about nature, civilization, and the boundaries of acceptable risk. The Hendersons and Pattersons organized a petition supporting immediate removal of the dangerous animal, while Pastor Williams and the church ladies began a prayer circle for God's creatures who find themselves unwelcome in human hearts. The financial strain of the testing created its own crisis for Robert. With Margaret's ring sold and his savings depleted, basic necessities became luxuries. Shadow seemed to sense the change, refusing the expensive dog food Robert had always provided and reverting to the hunting behaviors that had sustained him as a wild creature. Rabbits and squirrels began disappearing from the property with surgical precision, Shadow's predatory skills ensuring neither he nor Robert would go hungry. Local media picked up the story during the waiting period, transforming Robert and Shadow from private citizens into public symbols. The Missoulian ran a front-page feature titled "Man's Best Friend" or "Public Menace" that included photographs of Shadow that emphasized his size and wild appearance. Television crews from Helena and Billings requested interviews, turning Robert's private struggle into entertainment for viewers who would never face such impossible choices. The attention brought unexpected support from animal rights activists and wolf conservation groups, but also attracted protesters who viewed Shadow as evidence of regulatory failure. Robert's mailbox filled with letters ranging from offers of financial support to death threats promising to solve the wolf problem permanently. The cabin that had been his sanctuary became a fortress, with Robert screening every visitor and Shadow's protective instincts escalating in response to perceived threats. Dr. Johnson bore the professional burden of maintaining objectivity while watching her community tear itself apart. Her father's single-minded pursuit of Shadow's removal had created ethical conflicts that threatened both her practice and their relationship. When Stone suggested she might be compromised by emotional involvement, their argument could be heard throughout the clinic. "I've spent 15 years building trust with every pet owner in this county," Sarah shouted, her professional restraint finally breaking. "You're asking me to betray that trust because of your personal vendetta against wolves." "I'm asking you to remember that your first responsibility is to human safety," Stone replied, his voice carrying the cold authority of absolute certainty. "When that animal kills someone, their blood will be on your hands too." The waiting period became a countdown to Judgment Day, each passing day bringing increased tension and community polarization. Robert's health began showing the strain. His blood pressure spiked, his sleep became fitful, and the heart condition that had required medication since Margaret's death showed signs of worsening. Shadow seemed to mirror his stress, becoming more alert and protective, his wild instincts responding to threats both real and imagined. Martha Henderson's petition gained 73 signatures demanding immediate action, while Pastor Williams' prayer group organized a vigil supporting all God's creatures who seek love and acceptance. The Pine Ridge Community Center hosted a town hall meeting that devolved into shouting matches between neighbors who had coexisted peacefully for decades. Robert attended the meeting with Shadow at his side, the animal's calm presence contrasting sharply with the emotional chaos surrounding them. When given the opportunity to speak, Robert's words carried the quiet dignity of a man who had spent his life serving others. "I've been a member of this community for 23 years," he said, his voice steady despite the circumstances. "I've helped search for lost hikers, fought forest fires, and served on the volunteer emergency response team. I've never asked this town for anything except the right to love a creature who needed love. Shadow has proven his character through 18 months of peaceful coexistence. I'm asking you to judge him by his actions, not your fears." The response was mixed applause and angry murmurs, reflecting a community struggling to balance compassion with perceived safety. When Stone spoke, his words carried the weight of personal loss that silenced even his critics. "I lost my son to wolves 5 years ago," he said, his voice breaking slightly before recovering its professional tone. "Tommy was 8 years old, camping with his scout troop when wolves attacked their site. I held my boy while he died, listening to him ask why the dogs had hurt him. I won't let another parent experience that loss because we chose sentiment over safety." The revelation of Stone's personal tragedy reframed the entire debate, transforming him from an antagonist into a grieving father whose crusade suddenly seemed both understandable and tragic. The room fell silent as the weight of his loss settled over the assembly, making arguments about Shadow's gentleness seem insufficient against such devastating personal experience. On the 9th day of waiting, Robert received an unexpected visitor, Dr. Marcus Webb, a wildlife biologist from the University of Montana, arrived at the cabin with academic credentials and professional curiosity about Shadow's unique situation. His examination of Shadow revealed behaviors that challenged conventional understanding of wolf socialization. "This animal has adapted to human companionship in ways that contradict established research," Dr. Webb explained, his scientific objectivity struggling with the evidence before him. "Wolves typically maintain pack hierarchies and territorial behaviors that make domestic integration nearly impossible. Shadow has somehow suppressed those instincts in favor of interspecies bonding." The scientist's assessment provided hope that expert testimony might influence official decisions, but it also raised disturbing questions about Shadow's early development. If he was indeed a wolf who had adapted to human society, what traumatic experiences had shaped his unusual behavioral patterns? On the 10th day, Dr. Johnson called with the results that would change everything. Her voice carried the weight of scientific certainty and personal regret as she delivered news that everyone had been dreading and expecting in equal measure. "Robert, I need you to come in immediately. And Robert, bring someone with you for support." The drive to the clinic felt like a funeral procession, with Shadow sensing the gravity of the moment in ways that transcended understanding. As they pulled into the veterinary clinic's parking lot, Robert saw Sheriff Stone's patrol car already waiting, along with vehicles from the County Animal Control Department and local media outlets that had been monitoring the situation. "Whatever happens in there, boy," Robert whispered to Shadow, "remember that love doesn't change just because the world decides it's inconvenient." Shadow's amber eyes met his with an intelligence that seemed almost human, and for a moment, Robert could swear the creature understood exactly what was at stake. In 18 months, they had built a family that defied conventional definitions. Now, they would learn whether society had room for love that refused to fit into acceptable categories. The clinic's waiting room had been transformed into an unofficial courtroom, with representatives from multiple agencies waiting to hear scientific evidence that would determine Shadow's fate. As Robert and Shadow entered together for what might be the last time, the weight of legal authority and community judgment pressed down like a physical force. Dr. Johnson held the manila envelope containing test results that would either validate 18 months of unconditional love or condemn it as dangerous delusion. Her hands trembled slightly as she prepared to read findings that would satisfy legal requirements while potentially destroying the most remarkable human-animal bond she had ever witnessed. The moment of truth had arrived, and everyone present understood that whatever the test revealed, Pine Ridge would never be the same again. Dr. Sarah Johnson's hands trembled as she broke the laboratory seal, the manila envelope containing results that would either vindicate 18 months of love or condemn it as dangerous folly. The veterinary clinic's waiting room had transformed into an impromptu courtroom, packed with representatives from county animal control, local media, and community members whose lives would be forever changed by the scientific truth about to be revealed. "The genetic analysis is conclusive," Dr. Johnson announced, her professional voice barely concealing the emotional weight of her words. "DNA sequencing confirms that Shadow is 100% Canis lupus, eastern gray wolf. No domestic dog markers, no hybridization. He is a pure, wild wolf." The silence that followed was deafening. Robert felt the words hit him like physical blows, each syllable dismantling the fragile hope he'd clung to despite mounting evidence. 18 months of rationalization, of explaining away obvious signs, of choosing love over logic, all of it crumbled in the face of irrefutable scientific proof. Sheriff Marcus Stone's reaction was immediate and decisive. "Robert Miller, you are hereby ordered to surrender the animal to county authorities for immediate euthanization. Possession of an unregistered wolf constitutes a Class B felony under Montana state law." "No." The word escaped Robert's lips with surprising force, his ranger's backbone straightening despite the legal avalanche threatening to bury him. "He's family, Marcus. DNA doesn't change 18 months of love." The standoff that erupted would be remembered as the moment Pine Ridge's community fabric tore beyond repair. Stone advanced with the cold authority of absolute legal certainty, while Robert positioned himself protectively in front of Shadow, whose amber eyes tracked every movement with predatory precision. "Stand aside, Robert," Stone commanded, his hand moving instinctively toward his service weapon. "That animal is a loaded gun with 4 legs. Every moment he remains free is a threat to every child in this county." Shadow's transformation was immediate and terrifying. The gentle companion who had spent 18 months learning human social cues suddenly became something primordial, his massive frame coiling with power that had been hidden beneath domesticated behaviors. His lips pulled back slightly, revealing teeth designed for tearing rather than the grinding action of domestic dogs. For the first time since finding him, Robert saw Shadow as others did, an apex predator capable of devastating violence. "Easy, boy," Robert whispered, his voice carrying the authority of 18 months of trust. "Nobody's going to hurt you while I'm breathing." Dr. Johnson stepped between the two men, her professional training demanding she prevent the situation from escalating into violence. "Dad, wait. Before you do anything irreversible, there's something else you need to know about Shadow's behavior patterns." She opened Shadow's medical file, spreading 18 months of behavioral observations across the examination table like evidence in a trial. "This wolf has demonstrated impulse control that contradicts every established research parameter. He's been exposed to hundreds of potential triggers, children, other animals, territorial challenges, without a single aggressive incident. Past behavior doesn't predict future performance," Stone replied curtly, but uncertainty flickered in his eyes as he studied his daughter's meticulous documentation. "Wolves are pack hunters, Sarah. When his instincts activate, training won't matter. Outside the clinic, word of the DNA results spread through Pine Ridge like wildfire. Martha Henderson's anti-wolf faction claimed vindication, organizing an immediate demand for action, while Pastor Williams' supporters gathered to pray for God's creatures caught between nature and civilization. The community's philosophical divide became a physical one as protesters and supporters faced off in the clinic's parking lot. The media attention intensified exponentially. Network news crews arrived from Denver and Salt Lake City, transforming Robert's personal crisis into national entertainment. The story had everything producers craved: an elderly man's love for a dangerous animal, small-town division, and legal drama with life-or-death stakes. Camera crews positioned themselves strategically, ready to capture either a heartwarming reunion or a tragic enforcement action. Robert's health began showing the strain of sustained stress. His hands shook as he tried to process the legal documents Stone presented, his heart medication seeming inadequate against the emotional assault of losing another family member. Shadow pressed against his legs, the wolf's protective instincts recognizing distress in ways that transcended species boundaries. 72 hours, Stone announced, his voice carrying the weight of legal finality. The court order gives you 3 days to arrange for proper containment or surrender. After that, I'll obtain a warrant for immediate seizure. The countdown began immediately. Robert's modest cabin became a fortress as supporters and protesters maintained vigils on opposite sides of his property line. Pastor Williams organized prayer circles that rotated throughout the day, while Martha Henderson's faction held signs demanding justice for Tommy Stone and protect our children. The peaceful rural road transformed into a battleground of competing philosophies about nature, civilization, and the boundaries of acceptable risk. Dr. Marcus Webb, the wildlife biologist from the University of Montana, returned with additional colleagues who wanted to study Shadow's unique behavioral adaptations. Their presence provided temporary legitimacy to Robert's position. If scientists found Shadow worthy of study rather than elimination, perhaps there was hope for a solution beyond euthanization. This animal represents an unprecedented case study in wolf socialization, Dr. Webb explained to assembled media. His adaptation to human society challenges fundamental assumptions about predator domestication. From a scientific perspective, Shadow's preservation could advance our understanding of human-wildlife coexistence. But Stone remained unmoved by academic arguments. "I'm not running a research facility," he declared during a tense press conference. "My job is protecting citizens, not advancing scientific knowledge. That wolf is a public safety threat regardless of how interesting he might be to researchers." The legal battle intensified as animal rights organizations arrived with lawyers and injunctions, transforming Robert's personal struggle into a test case for exotic animal ownership laws. The American Civil Liberties Union filed emergency motions arguing that Shadow's 18 months of peaceful behavior constituted evidence of successful domestication, while the Montana Department of Fish, Wildlife, and Parks maintained that wild animals could never be considered truly safe in domestic settings. Robert found himself at the center of a national debate he'd never wanted to join. Television interviews became daily ordeals where his simple love for Shadow was dissected by legal experts and animal behaviorists who had never met either of them. The man who had sought only to fill the silence Margaret left behind was now defending his right to love something the world deemed dangerous. "He saved my life just as much as I saved his," Robert told one particularly aggressive interviewer. "When you've lived with loneliness that deep, you don't question love when it arrives. You're grateful, even when it comes with fangs." The quote became a viral sensation, spawning hashtags and memes that transformed Robert and Shadow into symbols for broader cultural debates about acceptance, family definitions, and society's tolerance for differences. Love with Fangs trended on social media platforms, while opponents countered with #public safety and #remember Tommy. Shadow seemed to understand the gravity of their situation with an intelligence that unsettled even his supporters. The wolf maintained perfect behavior during the crisis, demonstrating obedience and gentleness that made Stone's warnings seem paranoid. When children from Pastor Williams' congregation visited to pray for Shadow's safety, the massive predator lay calmly while small hands patted his fur, his amber eyes reflecting a patience that transcended species. But it was during the second night of the countdown that Shadow's wild nature reasserted itself in ways that terrified even Robert. Awakened by haunting howls that seemed to shake the cabin's foundation, Robert found Shadow on the back porch, his massive head tilted toward a full moon, calling to something primal that civilization couldn't touch. The sound carried for miles across the Montana wilderness, reaching the ears of every creature within its range. Other domestic dogs began howling in response, creating a symphony of wild music that reminded everyone listening that underneath domestication lay instincts older than human memory. For 30 minutes, Shadow's voice dominated the night, calling to ancestors and expressing needs that no human love could satisfy. When Robert approached, Shadow's transformation back to gentle companion was immediate but disturbing. The creature who had just proclaimed his wild heritage with such power now nuzzled Robert's hand with the affection of a domestic pet. The duality was unsettling. Which version was real? The loyal family member or the apex predator responding to evolutionary imperatives? The howling incident provided Stone with additional ammunition for his position. "You heard it too," he told the gathered media the next morning. "That wasn't a dog last night. That was a wild animal calling to his own kind, expressing instincts that 18 months of human love can't erase." Dr. Johnson found herself increasingly torn between professional objectivity and personal conviction. Her veterinary training supported her father's position. Wolves were indeed dangerous wild animals unsuited for domestic life. But 18 months of observing Shadow's behavior had convinced her that individual animals could transcend species generalizations. The conflict between scientific knowledge and empirical evidence was tearing her apart. "Dad, what if you're wrong?" she asked during a private moment away from media attention. "What if Shadow really is different? What if we're about to destroy something remarkable because we're too afraid to believe in exceptions?" Stone's response revealed the depth of his trauma and the impossibility of changing his mind. "Sarah, I held my son while he died from wolf attacks. I watched the light go out of his eyes while he asked why the dogs had hurt him. I can't risk another parent going through that hell because we chose to believe in exceptions." As the 72-hour deadline approached, Robert faced the most impossible choice of his life. Legal pressure was mounting, media attention was becoming unbearable, and his health was deteriorating under the strain. Shadow seemed to sense the approaching crisis, his protective behaviors intensifying as strangers gathered around their property. The final day brought unprecedented media coverage and community tension. Supporters organized a human chain around Robert's property, while opponents demanded immediate law enforcement action. The cabin that had been Robert's sanctuary became the epicenter of a national debate about love, law, and the boundaries of acceptable risk. Sheriff Stone arrived that evening with a warrant and backup officers, their vehicles creating a convoy of legal authority that could no longer be delayed or appealed. The standoff everyone had been dreading was finally at hand, with Robert and Shadow facing the full weight of governmental power, determined to enforce laws that made no allowances for love. As darkness fell over Pine Ridge, the community that had coexisted peacefully for generations was about to witness either a heartbreaking surrender or a tragic confrontation that would define them forever. The countdown had reached 0. and choices that had been postponed could no longer be avoided. The night air crackled with tension as Sheriff Stone's convoy surrounded Robert's property, emergency lights painting the pine trees in strobing red and blue. The 72-hour deadline had expired, and the legal machinery of Montana's wildlife protection laws ground forward with the inexorable weight of governmental authority. Robert stood on his front porch, shadow pressed against his legs, both of them facing the end of 18 months of unconditional love. "Robert Miller," Stone's voice boomed through a megaphone, carrying the cold formality of official business. "You are in violation of Montana State Code 87-4801, illegal possession of a dangerous wild animal. Surrender the wolf immediately or face felony charges." The media circus that had transformed Robert's quiet life into national entertainment reached fever pitch. Network television crews positioned themselves strategically, satellite trucks lined the rural road, and reporters provided breathless commentary for audiences who would never face such impossible choices. The story had everything American viewers craved: an elderly man's love for a dangerous animal, small-town drama, and legal confrontation with life or death stakes. Robert's response was barely audible above the mechanical chaos of official vehicles and media equipment. "He's not just a wolf, Marcus. He's my family. 18 months of love doesn't disappear because you found a piece of paper that says it's illegal." Shadow seemed to understand the gravity of their situation with an intelligence that transcended species. The massive wolf maintained perfect composure despite the threatening presence of armed officers, his amber eyes tracking every movement while his body remained protectively positioned between Robert and perceived threats. His behavior demonstrated the impulse control that had characterized 18 months of peaceful coexistence. Dr. Sarah Johnson emerged from one of the official vehicles, her veterinary credentials lending scientific authority to the proceedings. The conflict between professional duty and personal conviction was written across her face as she approached the porch where man and wolf made their final stand. "Robert, please," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "Don't make this harder than it has to be. We can sedate Shadow, make the process peaceful, but you have to let us do our job." The betrayal in Robert's eyes was devastating. The woman who had treated Shadow with professional care for 18 months was now part of the machinery designed to destroy him. "Your job?" Robert's voice carried the bitter edge of absolute disillusionment. "Your job is healing, Sarah, not execution." Pastor Williams and his supporters maintained their prayer vigil from the property line, their voices raised in hymns that provided ethereal counterpoint to the harsh efficiency of law enforcement. Martha Henderson's faction cheered from the opposite side of the road, their signs demanding justice for children who might someday face Shadow's wild instincts. Pine Ridge's community divide had become a physical manifestation of competing philosophies about risk, love, and the boundaries of acceptable tolerance. The standoff stretched into its second hour as legal representatives attempted to negotiate Robert's surrender. Animal rights lawyers filed emergency injunctions, while Montana Department of Fish, Wildlife, and Parks officials cited public safety regulations that left no room for individual exceptions. The case that had begun as a personal crisis was becoming legal precedent that would influence exotic animal legislation for decades. Robert's health began showing dangerous signs of stress-induced deterioration. His hands shook uncontrollably, his breathing became labored, and the heart condition that had required medication since Margaret's death showed alarming symptoms. Shadow pressed closer against his legs, the wolf's protective instincts recognizing distress in ways that transcended species understanding. "Margaret, what would you do?" Robert whispered to the night air, seeking guidance from the woman whose love had sustained him for 45 years. "How do you choose between the law and love?" The answer came in a memory so vivid it might have been Margaret's ghost providing counsel. She had always believed that love required sacrifice, that protecting those you care about sometimes meant making choices that broke your heart. The greatest act of love might be letting go. Dr. Marcus Webb, the wildlife biologist who had documented Shadow's remarkable behavioral adaptations, made one final appeal to reason. Sheriff Stone, this animal represents unprecedented scientific value. His socialization patterns could revolutionize our understanding of predator-human coexistence. Destroying him would be like burning a library. Stone's response revealed the depth of his trauma and the impossibility of changing his position. Doctor, I appreciate your scientific perspective, but my responsibility is preventing the next Tommy Stone. When that wolf's instincts activate, your research won't save the victim. The breaking point came when Shadow, sensing Robert's escalating distress, began displaying protective behaviors that transformed him from gentle companion into apex predator. His massive frame coiled with power, his lips pulled back to reveal teeth designed for tearing, and a low growl rumbled from his throat with enough menace to make armed officers step backward. "Stand down!" Multiple voices shouted simultaneously, weapons drawn and safeties released. The peaceful surrender everyone had hoped for was degenerating into a potential firefight with an animal whose protective instincts had finally overridden 18 months of careful socialization. Robert's heart attack struck with devastating suddenness. The crushing chest pain and sudden inability to breathe sent him collapsing to the porch steps, his medication scattered across the wooden planks. Shadow's transformation was immediate and heart-rending. The aggressive protector became a concerned companion, nuzzling Robert's face with desperate whines that sounded almost human in their distress. "Medical emergency!" Dr. Johnson shouted, her veterinary training translating seamlessly to human crisis. "Call for an ambulance immediately." The next 30 minutes became a blur of emergency medical response, with paramedics working to stabilize Robert while Shadow maintained a vigil that broke the hearts of everyone present. The massive wolf refused to leave Robert's side, his intelligent eyes tracking every medical procedure with an intensity that suggested he understood the gravity of his human's condition. Sheriff Stone faced an impossible decision as Robert was loaded into the ambulance. Seizing Shadow while his human was fighting for life seemed unnecessarily cruel, but allowing a wild predator to remain free violated every law enforcement protocol. The delay would later be criticized by his superiors, but in that moment, basic human decency outweighed legal requirements. 48-hour medical extension, Stone announced to the assembled crowd. "We'll wait until Robert's condition stabilizes before proceeding with seizure." The ambulance carrying Robert disappeared into the night, followed by a convoy of supporters and media vehicles. Shadow remained on the empty porch, his massive form silhouetted against the cabin's interior lights, waiting for a human who might never return. The image became iconic, a loyal creature maintaining faith while the world around him had descended into chaos. Dr. Johnson volunteered to monitor Shadow during the medical crisis, her professional credentials allowing her to remain on the property legally. The wolf's behavior during Robert's absence revealed the depth of their emotional bond. Shadow refused food, maintained constant vigil at the front door, and displayed signs of depression that concerned even his critics. "He's grieving," Dr. Johnson reported to her father during a tense phone conversation. "Dad, this animal is experiencing genuine emotional distress over Robert's condition." And that level of interspecies bonding contradicts everything we thought we knew about wolf psychology. Stone's response was predictably unmoved. "Emotional attachment doesn't change natural instincts, Sarah. When Robert dies, that wolf will revert to wild behaviors. We can't afford to find out what that looks like in a residential area." The hospital vigil became another media spectacle, as supporters maintained round-the-clock prayers for Robert's recovery, while opponents argued that his crisis proved the dangers of illegal exotic animal ownership. The Pine Ridge Community Hospital had never experienced such intense attention, with news crews camping in the parking lot and satellite trucks creating their own temporary city. Robert's condition remained critical but stable as his body fought to recover from stress-induced cardiac trauma. The doctors were pessimistic about his chances, citing his age and the emotional strain that had triggered the attack. Visitors reported that his only coherent words involved repeated requests to know about Shadow's welfare. On the second night of Robert's hospitalization, Shadow's behavior took a turn that would change everything. The wolf disappeared from the cabin, vanishing into the forest with a stealth that had characterized his species for millennia. Dr. Johnson's frantic search found no trace of the animal that had defined Pine Ridge's recent history. The disappearance created immediate panic among law enforcement officials who now faced the prospect of a wild predator loose in the community without any human control. Emergency alerts were issued, children were kept indoors, and hunting parties organized to track down the dangerous animal before he could hurt someone. But Shadow's destination wasn't random predatory behavior. He was going home to the wilderness that had shaped him, carrying 18 months of love into a world that had no place for creatures caught between civilization and nature. 3 days into the manhunt for Shadow, 6-year-old Emma Patterson disappeared during a family camping trip in the Bitterroot Mountains. The timing was catastrophic. A missing child and a loose wolf created a perfect storm of community terror that transformed Shadow from misunderstood companion into public enemy number one. Sheriff Stone's worst fears seemed to be materializing as search and rescue teams combed the wilderness for both predator and prey. The Patterson family had been camping at Willow Creek, 15 miles from Robert's cabin, when Emma wandered away from their campsite during the afternoon. Her disappearance triggered massive emergency response protocols, with helicopters, tracking dogs, and hundreds of volunteers scouring the dense forest that could hide a small child forever. The possibility that Shadow might encounter Emma during his own wilderness exile turned a routine search into a race against time. "Every moment that child remains missing increases the danger," Stone announced during an emergency press conference, his voice carrying the weight of personal tragedy and professional authority. "We have an apex predator loose in the same area where a vulnerable child is lost. The potential for catastrophe is enormous." The media coverage reached fever pitch as the story combined every element guaranteed to capture national attention: an endangered child, a dangerous predator, and a community's struggle with the consequences of misplaced compassion. Network news anchors provided breathless updates, while helicopter footage showed the vast wilderness where tragedy could unfold beyond human intervention. Robert, still recovering in Pine Ridge Community Hospital, watched the coverage with growing horror and helplessness. His heart monitor registered dangerous spikes every time Emma's photo appeared on screen, the weight of responsibility threatening to finish what the initial heart attack had started. Nurses limited his media exposure, but word of the missing child reached him through well-meaning visitors who couldn't hide their concern. "If Shadow hurts that little girl," Robert whispered to Pastor Williams during a bedside visit, "her blood will be on my hands. 18 months of love won't excuse what might happen out there." The search entered its second day with no sign of either Emma or Shadow, creating a nightmare scenario where rescuers had to consider the possibility of finding both together under circumstances too terrible to contemplate. Stone's deputies worked around the clock, coordinating with state wildlife officials and federal emergency management teams whose resources had transformed the quiet Montana wilderness into a military operation. Dr. Sarah Johnson found herself torn between hope and dread as she participated in the search efforts. Her professional knowledge of Shadow's behavior suggested he posed minimal threat to a child, but her understanding of wild animal unpredictability created gnawing doubt. The wolf, who had demonstrated perfect impulse control in domestic settings, might react differently when confronted by a frightened, crying child in his natural territory. The breakthrough came on the third morning when a Forest Service helicopter spotted movement in a remote canyon 20 miles from the last known search coordinates. Thermal imaging revealed two heat signatures, one small and human, one large and canine, positioned together beneath an overhang that provided shelter from the elements. The discovery sent shockwaves through the command center as the worst-case scenario seemed to be unfolding in real time. "We have visual contact with both subjects," the helicopter pilot reported, his voice tight with tension. "The child appears to be alive and moving. The animal is positioned directly beside her." Stone's response was immediate and decisive. "Maintain distance and prepare for tactical intervention. We need sharpshooters in position before attempting rescue." But as the helicopter circled the remote location, the scene below began revealing details that challenged everyone's assumptions. Emma Patterson wasn't cowering in terror from a menacing predator. She was curled against Shadow's massive form, using his body heat as a blanket while the wolf maintained protective watch over their shared shelter. The rescue operation that followed would be remembered as the most complex and emotionally charged in Montana's history. Stone led a team of armed deputies and wildlife specialists toward the canyon while snipers positioned themselves with clear shots at Shadow. The plan was military in its precision. Immobilize the predator while extracting the child with minimal risk to human life. Dr. Johnson insisted on joining the rescue team, her veterinary expertise potentially crucial for assessing Shadow's behavioral state. The trek through dense forest took 4 hours, with each step bringing them closer to a confrontation that could end in celebration or tragedy. The weight of Emma's life, Shadow's fate, and Robert's emotional survival pressed down on everyone involved. When the rescue team finally reached visual range of the shelter, the scene that greeted them defied every assumption about predator-prey relationships. Emma Patterson sat beside Shadow, talking to him in the unselfconscious way children addressed beloved pets. The wolf listened with patient attention, his amber eyes alert but calm, his massive frame providing windbreak against mountain weather that could have killed a child his size. "Dear God, Doc," Johnson whispered, her professional objectivity crumbling at the sight of interspecies cooperation that contradicted everything she'd been taught about wild animal behavior. "He's been protecting her." Stone's tactical training warred with the evidence before his eyes. Every protocol demanded immediate neutralization of the threat, but the threat appeared to be acting as guardian rather than predator. His sharpshooters maintained their positions while he struggled with a decision that would define both his career and his conscience. Emma's reaction to the approaching rescuers was immediate and heartbreaking. She threw her arms around Shadow's neck, her small voice carrying clearly across the canyon. "Don't hurt my friend. He kept me warm when I was scared." The child's testimony created an impossible situation for law enforcement officials whose entire response had been predicated on Shadow representing mortal danger. Here was the vulnerable victim they'd been racing to save, defending the predator they'd come to destroy. The role reversal challenged fundamental assumptions about human-animal relationships that had guided decades of wildlife management policy. Dr. Johnson approached the shelter slowly, her movements deliberately non-threatening as she assessed both child and wolf. Emma showed no signs of injury or trauma beyond the expected effects of 3 days in wilderness conditions. Shadow watched the approaching humans with wary intelligence but no aggression, his body language suggesting protection rather than territorial defense. "Emma, honey, are you hurt?" Dr. Johnson asked gently, maintaining eye contact with the child while monitoring Shadow's reactions. "Can you tell us what happened?" The 6-year-old's account would later become legendary in child psychology and animal behavior circles. She described how Shadow had found her crying and lost on the first day, how he'd led her to shelter and brought her water from a nearby stream. When she got cold, he'd curled around her like a living blanket. When she got hungry, he'd brought her berries and clean snow to eat. "He's the best dog ever," Emma declared with the absolute certainty of childhood innocence. "He sang to me when I was scared, and he chased away the scary noises at night." Stone's emotional breakdown was visible to everyone present. The man who had spent 5 years crusading against wolves based on his son's death was confronting evidence that contradicted his fundamental beliefs about predatory behavior. The same species that had killed Tommy had just saved Emma, demonstrating the kind of protective instinct that Stone himself brought to law enforcement. The extraction process required delicate negotiation between human authority and wolf intelligence. Shadow clearly understood that the approaching humans intended to separate him from the child he'd been protecting, but his response was mournful rather than aggressive. As Emma was gently coaxed away from their shelter, Shadow's amber eyes reflected a sadness that seemed almost human in its depth. "Thank you," Emma called back to Shadow as she was carried toward safety. "I'll remember you forever." The rescue operation concluded without violence, but the psychological impact rippled through everyone involved. Stone's deputies, who had approached expecting to confront a dangerous predator, instead witnessed the most remarkable display of interspecies compassion any of them had ever seen. The sharpshooters who had maintained firing positions lowered their weapons, unable to reconcile their training with the evidence of Shadow's heroic behavior. News of Emma's rescue and Shadow's role in her survival spread across the globe within hours. The story that had begun as cautionary tale about dangerous exotic pets had transformed into modern parable about the power of love to transcend species boundaries. Social media exploded with #ShadowHero hashtags, while news networks struggled to explain how their villain had become a hero. Robert's recovery accelerated dramatically when news of Shadow's heroic actions reached his hospital room. The man who had spent days drowning in guilt over Emma's disappearance suddenly found validation for 18 months of unconditional love. His wolf hadn't become a killer. He'd become a protector, extending the gentle nature he'd learned in their home to a frightened child who needed exactly what Shadow had always provided: patient, loyal, unconditional care. Sheriff Stone faced the most difficult decision of his career as media pressure and public opinion shifted dramatically in Shadow's favor. The wolf he'd been determined to destroy had just demonstrated the kind of heroic behavior that law enforcement officers aspired to achieve. The contradiction between his crusade and Shadow's actions created a crisis of conscience that would reshape his understanding of justice, mercy, and the possibility of redemption. The Pine Ridge Community Hospital had never witnessed anything like the celebration that erupted when Robert Miller was finally released after 2 weeks of recovery. What began as a small gathering of supporters had grown into a community-wide festival, with hundreds of residents lining the streets to welcome home the man whose love for an unlikely companion had challenged everything they thought they knew about family, loyalty, and the boundaries of acceptance. Shadow waited in the hospital parking lot, his massive form calm but alert as he sensed Robert's approaching presence. The reunion that followed would be remembered by everyone present as a masterclass in unconditional love transcending every obstacle society could construct. When Robert emerged in his wheelchair, Shadow's gentle approach and careful positioning beside his human demonstrated the intelligence and emotional depth that had saved Emma Patterson's life. "There's my boy," Robert whispered, his weathered hands finding the familiar comfort of Shadow's thick coat. I knew you'd come home. I knew you'd prove them all wrong." Sheriff Marcus Stone stood at the edge of the crowd, his uniform carrying new weight as he prepared to make the most difficult announcement of his 20-year career. The investigation into Shadow's behavior during Emma's rescue had forced him to confront uncomfortable truths about his own motivations and the possibility that grief had transformed justice into vengeance. "Citizens of Pine Ridge," Stone announced, his voice carrying across the assembled crowd with the authority of absolute conviction. "After thorough investigation and consultation with wildlife experts, county legal counsel, and emergency management officials, I am officially dropping all charges against Robert Miller. Shadow will be granted permanent sanctuary status as a registered emotional support animal with full legal protections under Montana state law." The cheers that erupted could be heard for miles, a sound of pure joy that echoed across the Montana wilderness like Shadow's howls, but carrying a message of unity rather than wild longing. Martha Henderson's opposition had crumbled in the face of Emma's testimony, while Pastor Williams's prayer circle had grown into a movement supporting all creatures who found themselves unwelcome in traditional families. Dr. Sarah Johnson stepped forward with official documentation that would transform Shadow from illegal exotic pet into recognized therapy animal. The paperwork represented months of bureaucratic navigation, expert testimony, and legal precedent that would influence exotic animal legislation across the country. Shadow's case had become a model for how love, properly documented and professionally supervised, could transcend species boundaries. Shadow will undergo quarterly behavioral assessments and maintain current veterinary care, Dr. Johnson announced, her professional pride evident as she described the monitoring system that would ensure both Shadow's welfare and community safety. He'll also be participating in a groundbreaking research program studying human-animal therapeutic relationships. The transformation of Pine Ridge itself had been equally remarkable. The community that had been divided by fear and misunderstanding had found unity in celebrating difference rather than demanding conformity. Local businesses had embraced Shadow's celebrity status, creating wolf-themed merchandise that donated proceeds to animal rescue organizations. The Pine Ridge Tourist Board promoted the town as "where love has no boundaries," attracting visitors from around the world who wanted to meet the famous wolf and his devoted human. Robert's modest cabin had been renovated by community volunteers during his hospitalization, creating accessibility features that would allow him to age in place while maintaining his independence. Shadow's presence had given Robert a reason to focus on his health, and the combination of purpose and love had improved both his physical condition and emotional well-being beyond anything his doctors had thought possible. Emma Patterson's family had become regular visitors, their 6-year-old daughter insisting on reading stories to Shadow during weekend visits. The bond between child and wolf had deepened rather than faded, creating an extended family that defied conventional definitions while demonstrating the possibility of love transcending every boundary humans had constructed. "Family isn't about blood or species," Robert reflected during an interview that would be broadcast nationally. "It's about choosing to show up day after day, regardless of what the world thinks about your choices. Shadow chose me as much as I chose him. That's what makes us family." As autumn painted the Montana landscape in shades of gold and crimson, Robert and Shadow settled into their new normal with the contentment of those who had survived the storm and found peace on the other side. Their evening walks through Pine Ridge drew waves and smiles from neighbors who had learned that love, properly nurtured, could transform fear into understanding. The story that had begun with a dying creature on a snowy highway had become a testament to the power of unconditional love to heal not just individuals but entire communities. In choosing to save Shadow, Robert had unknowingly saved himself, his town, and everyone touched by their remarkable bond. Sometimes the greatest gifts come with fangs, and sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is love without conditions. But as Robert and Shadow proved to a watching world, those dangerous choices often lead to the most extraordinary transformations of all. Dear friends, Robert's journey with Shadow reminds us of a profound truth many of us discover in our golden years. The greatest love often arrives when we least expect it, and sometimes it doesn't look like what we thought we wanted. At 68, Robert thought his story was ending, widowed, alone, watching life pass by his window. Then a dying creature needed him, and everything changed. How many of us have felt that same crushing loneliness after losing a spouse, after children move away, after retirement leaves us wondering if our purpose died with our paychecks? Robert's love for Shadow wasn't just about saving an animal, it was about discovering that our capacity to love and be needed never expires. It grows deeper, more precious, more necessary. Shadow didn't just fill the silence in Robert's cabin, he filled the silence in Robert's heart. And when the world tried to take that love away, an entire community learned that family isn't defined by law or convention. It's defined by who shows up, who stays, who chooses to love despite the risks. Your next chapter might be waiting in the most unexpected place, needing exactly what you have to give. What unexpected blessing entered your life when you thought your best days were behind you? How has caring for someone or something else helped heal your own wounded heart? Please share your stories below. Your words might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.